So it's on.
Yes, sir. We can start now. Hello?
Yes, hello?
Yeah, hello, Ricardo. Hi, so today we're going to be talking about Western civilizations and some of your ideas. Ricardo, it was once popular for scholars like David Landis and Samuel Huntington to articulately defend the West. I once read a piece written by Sam in which he argued that Western law is superior to other legal systems and unique. But since the early part of the 21st century, Western civilization has been under assault from both the left and the right. What is the cause of this new situation?
Well, I think now this is not the view I held when I wrote my book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, which I completed in 2010 and it was published in 2011. Then I used to think that we had a conflict of values, that the leftist ideology dominated our universities. And I still think that, but I also think that the globalists, both on the right and the left, have this commitment to diversify all Western nations and create a multiracial society. And I think this is also driving them to argue that we cannot have the West as a European, strictly Western civilization. It has to become a world civilization, the universal civilization with multiculturalism as a key foundation. So I started noticing this years ago that they were trying to argue that the West had been created by multiple cultures. And there is no question that the West was very connected to many other cultures. And this is one of the reasons why it managed to be so creative, because it absorbed many currents from elsewhere. But at the same time, we have to be truthful and realize that when we talk about the Enlightenment or the Renaissance or the rise of modern science, we're talking about developments that happen in the West, not elsewhere. So we have to look for reasons within the West to understand these developments rather than to argue that all the world's peoples and cultures were part of the civilization of the West, which is what they want to argue now, because they believe that if you have a diverse classroom, you have to make everybody in the classroom feel that they were part of creating the West. So if many Mexicans come to the United States, they want to argue that Mexicans were also instrumental in creating the legal system in the United States, in promoting Newtonian science. So it is getting absurd. And I think that that is a big reason this program to diversify Western nations today is making them want to revise the history of the past so that it fits with this program.
But Ricardo, the Greeks were exposed to foreign civilizations and they never denied this reality. Western civilization is easily rejuvenated by foreign cultures. The Greeks learned from the Egyptians and they're proud of that fact. Westerners on average are also less ethnocentric. So my argument is quite simple. If the West is a defender of liberty, human rights, and free people, and less ethnocentric, why do Westerners dislike themselves so much, especially elites? Because when compared to other cultures, Western culture is less ethnocentric. So, for example, China is the Chinese civilization. The Japanese are uninterested in immigration, and we wouldn't go to China and say to them, don't teach Confucius. Yet there's a movement to decolonize education in the West. It seems to me that Westerners are oblivious to the fact that they're more tolerant when compared to other cultures.
Right. It is a paradox that the civilization which happens to be the least ethnocentric um, blames itself for being the most ethnocentric. And as you were saying, you can go way back to the ancient Greeks to realize that Westerners have always acknowledged the influence of other cultures. The Greeks held particularly Egyptian civilization in high esteem. They knew that its history went back thousands of years before the Greeks had managed to create their own civilized way of existence. So it is, as I said, a paradox that Westerners have this kind of guilt about their own culture and somehow blame themselves for all the troubles that are happening elsewhere in the world and believe that if only we eliminate our ethnocentrism and our racist attitudes, then we will become a better civilization. Whereas other cultures don't think like that at all. They realize that the West is self-destructing and has no sense of pride and dignity. So they're exploiting that. And it's gonna really damage, and it's already damaging in many ways the nature of Western civilization, that it is going along this path. So it is one of those things that I did argue a lot about in my book as to why it is that the one civilization that created the most open society, the concept of equal legal rights and individual rights that in many ways was open to immigrants from other cultures, has now really turned on against itself in a very devastating way.
Because Ricardo, the West globalized human rights. So, for example, the Dahomey civilization in Africa had no concept of individual freedom. And Orlando Patterson, in his book, Freedom in the Making of Western Civilization, argues that freedom is a uniquely Western concept. So, Westerners abolished slavery, particularly the British. The British abolished slavery and later imposed pressure on countries in the Middle East and Latin America to follow suit. Yet, Westerners are forced to reconcile with their history of slavery, though slavery is still practiced in some African countries. Westerners abolished slavery. They started the human rights campaign to shame countries engaged in slave practices. Even today, this is still occurring. But for some strange reason, as we both mentioned earlier, Westerners cannot appreciate their uniqueness.
Yes, they can. And on the issue of slavery, this is a very important subject because, as you know, in the United States, many leaders of the Black community and including academics are continuously raising the fact that the United States had proportion of its population as slaves and that they imported thousands and thousands of slaves from Africa. So they keep bringing this up and holding them accountable to this day. And now some people are talking about reparations. But what they don't say is that the West was responsible for the abolition of slavery across the world. Now, when the Europeans arrived in Africa, they had no slavery in their own lands. So you can go back to Roman times and there was slavery. Then Christianity came along and it prohibited the idea of enslaving other human beings. And in medieval Europe, there was no slavery. You had serfdom, and then from serfdom, eventually you had free peasants. So these Europeans who arrived in Africa, they were not people that were enslaving each other, but they encountered a culture of slavery in Africa, that Africans were enslaving each other, different tribal groups, and they did exploit that situation for their own advantage. And as I said, they brought thousands and thousands of slaves across the Atlantic. But eventually, there was a very strong, powerful anti-slavery movement in the United States, led by Christians. These people play a big role in persuading Americans generally that it was immoral, this slave trade, and that it was also immoral to have slaves in the United States. But this history is not taught. They prefer the history of making whites feel guilty because there is an agenda. The agenda is that they're going to radically transform Western civilization and create a thoroughly multicultural civilization, which they believe is superior and should no longer. I mean, they do aim at this. They will no longer call it Western. They want to get rid of that word. That word is now seen in a bad light in academia. I mean, I know from experience that teaching Western civilization was not looked well by other academics. And the if you go back just a few decades ago, Western civilization was a required course in many colleges in the United States. Today, from the last statistics that I saw, I think in maybe about 2% of American colleges is Western civilization a required course. So now it is just optional, and even you will find that many academics don't want to teach it. They feel that they will be accused of Western ethnocentrism and, or in fact, of white supremacy. So that's the reality we're dealing with.
But Ricardo, we can easily correct this problem by diversifying the curriculum. If we teach students African history, Indian history, and Asian history, then they will be in a better position to form conclusions. So, for example, Sean Stillwell has a brilliant book on slavery in Africa. One can purchase it or read it online. The Asante Empire practiced slavery. Slaves were also sacrificed. Benin sacrificed slaves. In America, Black slave owners were noted for their brutality. Calvin Wilson, Carter G. Woodson, Philip Schwartz, various scholars have written on black slavery in the United States. So if we're truly interested in diversity, then we can decolonize the curriculum, but students must be given the opportunity to choose and form a judgment. And I do believe that if our students are exposed to the truth, then they will develop a greater appreciation for Western civilization. But the problem is this: the curriculum is shallow and nonsensical. Instead of introducing lectures on foreign cultures, the West is attacked because academics are smart. They recognize that if we force students to compare Western civilization to non-Western civilizations, they're going to choose the West.
Yes, I mean, as you know, Western peoples actually were the ones who began to develop studies of other cultures, archaeology, the archaeology that brought out ancient Egypt to the public, that excavated the past monuments and writing systems and all of that. The many books that were published about Mesopotamia, about Egypt.
Egyptology, that's a European creation, a Western creation.
Right. So they have done this across the world through anthropology, archaeology, paleontology, you name it. In one discipline after another, they have tried to understand other cultures, to write their history, to be fair-minded. But and for a few decades in universities, there were many good fields of studies, and they still are to some degree. And then they would also learn about the West. And so when they were teaching the West, they were not excluding other civilizations and cultures. To the contrary, they were including them. But in, I would say, starting in the 1980s into the 1990s, this accelerated. There were there were many academics coming from the left who then started looking at the West as something negative. I think in part of the reason is that some of them kind of realized that the West had developed modern science, technology, and uh, liberal legal systems and so on, and that they sense this was a good thing, and it was not good for that reason, because other peoples and other cultures would be left out. And as I was saying before, they wanted to create what they call a more inclusive history of the world, in which all cultures were deemed to be equal. At the same time, there are many radical Marxists who believe that the key difference about the West is that it was more aggressive in a military way against other cultures, and that it exploited them and extracted their resources. So they begin to pound on this idea that this is what makes the West unique. And to this day, if you ask many people, students who have just a bit of knowledge about the West, and you ask them why do you think the West industrialized first and became powerful in the late 19th and 20th century? They will say, oh, because it exploited other cultures, enslaved Africans. That's the image they have. They don't know anything about the Renaissance, about the Enlightenment. They can barely mention a great thinker, and if they do, they never read that thinker, because that is no longer taught. Very rarely. You have to really look for it to get that kind of knowledge. So I think it is an inversion of reality, what is happening now, that the very civilization that achieved the most is the most denigrated civilization right inside the West, which is amazing. So China today is exploiting this. They sense the West is very weak, that the elites are not for their own people, whereas they are. They're very proud of their heritage. This is what they teach in their schools, they're going to exploit that. And the West is just going to shrink. I mean, you look at Biden, the situation with him. So I see the West going a very, very dark age, a very bad period that's going to last for a while. I don't see us turning this around anytime soon. They are in the, they're in the driver's seat, the people who are anti-Western right now.
Ricardo, I agree with you 100%. There will be a new dark age because if we're unable to analyze data or reason, it becomes very difficult to produce quality information, and innovation will also die. So I do agree with you that we're living in a new dark age because there's also an attack on reason. We can no longer assess the pros and cons of an argument. It is either we agree with the prevailing orthodoxy or we're idiots. But you stated an important point about Westerners and warfare. Again, this is strange to many people, but Africans were formidable warriors. The Asante Empire gave the British a real fight. The Zulu Empire was also a very strong power in Africa. And it should be stated that when Africans fought, they wanted to kill their enemies. Prisoners of wars were treated poorly, and Lawrence Keeley makes this point in his book, War Before Civilization. So again, in the realm of human rights, Westerners do have an edge. But I want to ask an important question. What is the root of our Faustian spirit in the West? The Greeks were very innovative, intellectual. Medieval culture was quite dynamic. Westerners are always willing to change when confronted with superior practices. What is the root of this Faustian spirit?
Well, it's not easy to really say what is the root of this Faustian spirit. As you know, I borrowed that term from Oswald Spengler,
Yes.
and he arguing his two-volume book, The Decline of the West, that there was this drive, this energy, this attempt to reach the skies, to conceive the infinite. Um, and so he uses all these metaphors and images to convey to you what the Faustian spirit is about. I wrote in an article, which I did soon after The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, that in my view, the explorers of Western civilization, the men who explore um, Antarctica. They went right to the middle of Antarctica, the northern pole, many rivers around the world, climbed the highest mountains, mapped the entire earth, and these kinds of things that you see there, a Faustian spirit, because a Faustian spirit is achieving the highest simply because you wish to do so and to be remembered. So when you think of the men who went to the middle of Antarctica, the argument that they're going there for resources and this guy stands to gain from that, it doesn't make sense to me. I think it's a spirit that drives them to be the first. They just want to be the first to reach the middle of Antarctica, something that is very difficult, almost impossible to achieve, and they want to achieve it or climb the highest mountain. uh, so you may be able to detect that Faustian spirit by looking at the writings and the history of the major explorers, what motivated them and drove them to do these things. You could also argue that if you go back to the Indo-Europeans, that the whole lifestyle that they lived in the Pontic steppes is an area around what is Ukraine today. These are flat lines where horses were for the first time domesticated, and then they were ride on. People would ride on them, and that this was a factor. Then you see the invention of wheeled vehicles, chariots. You see a diet that includes animals as a major component of the diet, which was not the case in the other civilizations. So you might say these are the material factors that nurture this Faustian spirit. I don't think that by speaking of this Faustian spirit, you're going to capture everything about the West. And as you know, there is a book that has come out by Joseph Henry.
Yes.
Yes, that he talks about the weirdness of Europeans. So this is another way also of trying to capture this different psychological profile of European peoples. Someone like Henrich and many others would argue that their term is more accurate because they have a lot more evidence to back it up, whereas the Faustian concept is ambiguous, is just a philosophical speculative statement. Either way, I mean, I think both terms capture certain different aspects. The Faustian spirit captures more that energy, that drive for the highest, whereas the idea of weirdness captures the modern mentality of Europeans behind the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. And it has to do a lot with their individualism and lack of kinship, collective
Yeah.
ties. Yes.
Yeah, that's the argument postulated by Joseph in his book that the medieval church outlawed cousin marriages, and as a result, if you're forced to interact with people outside of your family, you develop social capital, and you're also encouraged to trust strangers. But the Faustian spirit of the West is best expressed by our intellectuals. I have read several white men who specialize in African history. You're more likely to identify a white man studying African history or Chinese history than the reverse. So Westerners are extremely inquisitive, and I'm fascinated. I'm utterly fascinated because on one side, it is said that Westerners are ethnocentric and they're uninterested in non-white peoples. However, the academics who specialize in foreign cultures tend to be Westerners.
Yes, I mean, I also wrote about that the Faustian spirit includes this drive to know, to get to know the unknown. Um, and Hegel is someone that talks about this, although he doesn't say Faustian spirit, he does say that in the West, you see a spirit in which you don't want to let nature be and not have an explanation for why things happen the way they happen. Other cultures took it for granted. As you know, Indian culture was very passive in the way it looked at the natural world. It sees it as a reality that is mysterious and beyond comprehension, whereas Westerners were not satisfied with that. They wanted to dig deeper and come up with some of the laws that explain the movements of things in the sky and also here on earth. So the Faustian spirit is also expressed in that way. And then the fact that they were driven to understand the histories of the cultures of the world, and that really almost all the disciplines that are taught in our universities, geography, geology, archaeology, biology, you name it, is a field of study that was driven by this curiosity. Sociology, economics, all these disciplines express this Faustian spirit. And I do think that the concept of weirdness doesn't capture that. I mean, as you know, Joseph Henry says that Europeans became weird after the Catholic Church dismantled their kinship groups and extended families, but he has no explanation as to why it is that the ancient Greeks made so many major or offered so many insights in philosophy, in astronomy, in mathematics, um, in ways of writing, tragic writing, epic writing. So these things, he has no explanation for that. And you could argue in a kind of very general way that you see among the Greeks this Faustian spirit. You also see it among the Romans in the way they created this incredible empire in the area of the world that was the most contested area of the world, because I understand that the Mongols also created a very large empire. Some people say the largest empire, but it was not in the most contested area of the world. And the legacy of the Mongol Empire is far less than the legacy of the Roman Empire, because the Romans felt this affinity with the Greeks and they respected it. Even though they were not at the same level of philosophical knowledge, they did produce some incredible historians and also an incredible legal system. And the empire that they created, I mean, the reality of life is that human beings have been struggling with each other since the moment we were primates. It's just a fact of nature, and the Romans were very successful in this. And then they created an empire within which they tried to have more peaceful relationships among the inhabitants of that empire. And this is what the legal system is about, to have rules so that human beings um, resolve their conflicts that way rather than through constant feuds between families.
Very, very interesting points as usual. But there's also another pressing matter, the role of commercialization. Whenever Europeans create products, or if they are introduced to foreign products, these products are used to create wealth. So for example, the clock. Europeans measure time using the clock. The Chinese were technologically superior to the West for several centuries, but they didn't use the clock appropriately. They printed less books. When Europeans discovered the art of printing, printing became a big business. And this is also another fascinating point. Why are Europeans so eager to produce and to appropriate knowledge and to be productive? There's a difference between talent and commercialization. One can be brilliant, but if you fail to commercialize your ideas appropriately, then you will lose. And Europeans had the edge because they were more productive and likely to commercialize their ideas and the ideas of other countries.
Yes, I mean, it is a standard argument that the Chinese were first in the invention of printing machines, mechanical clocks, paper, and so on. but there is a fundamental difference in what happened in China. You can take each of these technologies, their mechanical clocks, which were really, really water clocks, and you can take their printing machines, and you can see that they invented them and created a few of them, but they never really improved upon them. It was just a one-time phenomenon with minimal improvements thereafter. Whereas what you see in Europe, and this is something that the historian Lynn White said long time ago,
Mm.
he said you,
Yeah, Lynn White, yes, the medievalists.
yes, he said you notice this uh, continuous tinkering, continuous attempt to improve the technology generation after generation. So you take the mechanical clock, it not only was it a fundamentally different type of technology because it was no longer based on water, but also it was not a one-time phenomenon. It's almost as if everybody in Europe, I mean, not everybody, but the people who are interested in these kinds of things got into it and began to try and come up with a better version of it and another better version. And you find this across many technologies. They continuously try and make them better than someone did in the past. So this phenomenon needs to be explained. And you could also, again, argue that it's part of this Faustian spirit. You could also say it's part of their individualism. But
Yes,
yeah,
yes, and then the Latin West is the, the story of the Latin West is very intriguing because when medieval scholars were exposed to Arabic learning, they adjusted their philosophies. Adelard of Bath, Thomas Aquinas, and other leading luminaries. The Chinese, in contrast, were introduced to Western science by the Jesuit, but that did not spark a serious intellectual revolution that was sustained. China had bouts of intellectual revolutions, but none of them became permanent. And I think this is an issue that we need to discuss and talk about more freely.
oh yes, I mean, there is a book by Toby Hoff.
Yes,
Of
very brilliant book. He wrote 2 volumes.
Yes, and one that I'm thinking about is about the reception of the Chinese um, to the telescope and other technologies. And they were curious about them, but they never really cared to find out more and to really inquire as to what is the nature of this technology and what can it do. They took it as toys, even when um, Sheng Ho did his famous navigation around the Indian Ocean, and he went quite far down south through the African coast, maybe as far as Madagascar. But it was not a planned expedition in the way that the Portuguese organized their expeditions. The Portuguese set up a whole center for developing navigational techniques and ways to do it properly using the latest ways of navigating. And then they would slowly and gradually go down the African coast and map and calculate and tabulate everything that they were doing for many decades. Whereas the Chinese came in these very big, luxurious vessels, and they were kind of wanting people to honor them and to admire them and to receive homage from them. And they became very curious about the giraffes and other uh, exotic animals they saw in other areas of the world, but they were not exploring. And in fact, they didn't really navigate in any area of the earth that had not been navigated before in a known way. So I wouldn't say that they were explorers. Whereas when you see the European discovery of the Americas, even if you argue that Columbus didn't know where he was going and that to his death he thought he had arrived in China, that's just Columbus. The fact is that you see one explorer after another following in his footsteps, both into the Atlantic, and then as I was mentioning, the Portuguese rounding the tip of southern Africa and then moving into the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese did this by the end of the 1400s, and then for the next 50 years or so, they were the supreme power in the Indian Ocean, all the way to uh, the east, where China is. But the Portuguese were soon followed by the Dutch and the English and many other countries. And so the same thing goes for Columbus. He was the first, but then he soon followed by people who moved into what is Canada today, like Cabot and Champlain. And then you have other explorers from other nations of the world. So it is a phenomenon again, as we were saying before, that you see, as I was saying in the case of mechanical clocks, you have to understand that this is not a one-time phenomenon, but what really stands out are the continuous improvements, the innovations upon the invention. And the same thing with these explorations. And then they started mapping the whole world, and you see a real cartographic revolution culminating in the Mercator map by the mid 1500s. And this goes on after that. That's why, in the case of the Industrial Revolution, um, some people prefer to say there was the first industrial revolution that started around the 1750s, and then you have another second industrial revolution starting in the 1850s, and thereafter we have this continuous improvement. So we have the revolution hasn't stopped. And so you can really contrast this to what you were saying about the Jesuits. The Jesuits went to China with the intention of, spreading Christianity, but also they brought their technologies, gunpowder and telescopes, and the Chinese just didn't build upon it.
Yeah, the Westerners went on voyages to explore and create new markets. The Chinese over were interested in projecting superpower status. I think this is quite clear. And another interesting feature of Western civilization, the idea of progress. The idea of progress is very central in the Western intellectual tradition. So, for example, the Chinese relied on new knowledge to justify old traditions, but Westerners are objective. A Westerner in 1700 will argue that people who resided in 1525 were backward. Why is the idea of progress so central to understanding the Western mind, and to what extent is it linked to Christianity and the Christian concept of linear time?
Yes, the idea of progress is uniquely Western, and my view is that you cannot have an idea of progress. In fact, I don't think you can really have an idea of history itself unless your society is changing, is progressing and developing. Because if your society is repeating itself, or going through cycles of up and down, and then when you get back up it's just a repetition of a past golden age, then you're not going to have an idea of history and progress. So the idea of progress is uniquely Western. Now, there is a lot of controversy as to when this idea emerged. The most, you might say, there are two common competing arguments. One is that you trace it back to Christianity. The other one is that the idea of progress comes with the Enlightenment, sometime in the 1700s. This is the idea of the historian Bury, or Bury.
Yes,
Um,
J.B. Bury, he has a brilliant book on Greece.
Yes, and he has the other book on the idea of progress, which is a classic. And so, if you take his view, then you would argue that it starts with the Enlightenment. But there's some people who believe that the concept of progress, that there is some kind of linear uh, movement in history, that we're going somewhere, that there is a meaning and a purpose in history, is a Christian idea. My view is that this idea of progress, you cannot see it in the Old Testament, that it only becomes an idea that Christians begin to think about when Christians start to study the the past, when they look at ancient Greece and Rome, and they're trying to make sense of these two civilizations and how they uh, fit within the Christian scheme of things, because they know that there is a whole new, for Christians, there's a whole new starting point with Jesus Christ. And so but at the same time, they understood that a lot had been achieved in the past. They were educated in the Greek philosophy, and they knew about Roman administration and the universal empire they created. So when Christians start to think about this, and they fit Greece and Rome, and then they put Christianity there, and then they start thinking about the Catholic Church during the medieval era, trying to convert more and more people to Christianity, and they build universities, and they see the rise of uh, towns and cities. They kind of start thinking about progress, about there being some sort of improvement and a pattern in history. So this is the Christian idea. Other people think no, that it really came with the Enlightenment, because only then do you have for one, a more comprehensive understanding of history, if only because now you're talking about the 1700s and a lot of things have happened, and they could see the Renaissance and the discovery of the world and the scientific revolution. So they could see those things and try and fit them within a scheme. And so it's only in the 18th century that you see this notion of precise stages of history. You see this in the Scottish Enlightenment, um, and you see it in the French Enlightenment as well.
Yes, I as usual amazing points, but in interesting argument. James Billington in his book Fire in the Eyes of Men informed us that secular thinkers were inspired by mystical cults. So there's this view that during the Enlightenment, these men and women were solely rational. That's not particularly true. They were also mystic, and to an extent even worse than some Christians.
You mean the Enlightenment people were
Yes, some of them were influenced by mystical cults and the Freemasons, etc. So it wasn't a movement that was solely built on reason.
no, of course. I mean, this is even the case today when you talk about a population in those days during the 1700s. Uh, you didn't have schools. Most people were illiterate and ignorant. And even the people that were educated, depending where you are, in the case of Germany, for a long time, you had people that were very mystical and spiritual. And then you had the Romantic movement, which was a reaction against the industrial mechanistic worldview. So this is again one of those things that demonstrates this creativity. I am not of the view that the West is rational and then the rest of the world is not rational. That's a very inaccurate conception. The rationality of the West is emphasized because it had very deep consequences with science and the industrial revolution. So when you apply this kind of rationality and you create a whole new society, then you can see its impact. But there have been many other currents and ways of thinking and feeling about the world. You see it in the Romantic movement, you see it later on in existentialism and other philosophical outlooks, in poetry, in painting. So there is this, texture that has to be taken into account, that speaks about the uniqueness of the West, including something that may seem simple to some people, but I don't think it is, the writing of novels. Um, this is a phenomenon that is also unique to the West.
Yes, and biographies, etc. So, for example, Saint Augustine was born in North Africa, but his ideas are far more prolific in the West. So again, Westerners are often willing to learn. But Ricardo, the medieval ages, why are they important?
The medieval ages, for one, is a very long period. So
Yes.
we're talking. Let's say that the Roman Empire is gone by 500 A.D., and so we use that rough date to start thinking about medieval Europe. So medieval Europe starts 600, 500 AD, and then it goes on all the way to the end of 1200 to the 1300s. That's a very long time. So that's something that has to be taken into account.
Mm.
The other thing is that there is no doubt that Christianity played a very, very important role
Yes, the
in,
church built the legal system.
yes, in the making of the West. I was talking before about how it is that Christians, there was a big debate as to how do we connect to the pagan past. And I think the consensus in the end was that a lot had been achieved. The books of the ancient Greeks must be translated, must be copied, and must be taught, including the Bible and religious writings. So they didn't exclude that tradition, they included it. And eventually, during medieval times, you see them inventing universities. It was a whole new phenomenon as a center of learning that has autonomy. They govern themselves. So what they teach is something that is decided by the people that have the knowledge and work in these universities. It's not mandated by some religious authority or the king, but they themselves decide what is the curriculum. And they have a curriculum that draws a lot from the past. They emphasize things that the Greeks and the Romans had also spoken about. But the Greeks and Romans didn't have formal universities as autonomous institutions. But in the case of medieval Christians, they develop an incredible curriculum where they teach grammar, music, astronomy, theology, logic, and this has to be taken into account as a major contribution. Another thing is that these barbarians, the Germanic barbarians, I do believe that the Roman Empire has had exhausted itself. It was a corrupt, decadent culture by the third century AD, and that the Germanic peoples came in as a useful, energetic, yes, barbarian people, but they added new blood and new energies. They themselves had this Faustian energy and spirit, but they were barbarian. They were very violent. They were not civilized. They would not by themselves with their cultures develop educational systems and legal systems. Christianity gave them that. And Christianity also calmed them down. It imposed monogamy on them. The Greeks and Romans had monogamy, but the Catholic Church really imposed it in a more strict way with all kinds of legislative measures. And because they had churches everywhere and they were able to sort of spread this across the population and then also impose monogamy upon the ruling elites. And so the elimination of polygamy was a very stabilizing factor in the development of civilization in Europe. Because in my view, you can't have the ruling class practicing polygamy and have a stable society. If only because you don't know who's going to inherit it, who really is your child. Is it with the first wife, the second, or the third? And then these different wives with their families begin to bicker with each other and kill each other, and there's always chaos. So monogamy also is better for children and better for women too. There are many studies out there that demonstrate that polygamy has many negative consequences. So I think it has to be taken into account that Christianity play a big role as well because of this emphasis on monogamy and um, just educating people to control their instincts, to moderate their behaviors in reference to many things like drinking and partying and violence, just uh,
Mm.
trying to calm down the European population so that it can build a civilization.
Yeah, Ricardo, the barbarians were willing to learn from Christian monks and bishops. And what is often discounted is that the early church protected widows, women, and abandoned babies, especially girls who were whose parents would have wanted to abort them. So some would argue that the church is patriarchal, but history teaches us that the church has been a blessing for women. The medieval church, for example, allowed women to marry without gaining the consent of male relatives.
Yes.
So so if we're going to discuss Christianity, we must make reference to the family, the legal institutions, particularly criminal law, equity, etc. Western civilization is the legacy of Christianity. Another force is too, but Christianity is pivotal if one wants to understand the West.
Oh, yes. I mean, I think it is. I don't think that the Germanic barbarians on their own would have really
Mm,
preserved the legacy of the
mm,
West if it had not been because of the Christian educational program. Christianity emphasized a lot the development of the spirit, the development of the intellect, and that meant education. The monks, I don't think it's an accident that it was the monks who uh, wrote all these books back and preserved them from ancient times. So without them, who would have done that? I don't see any other group doing this except the monks and people that got educated in the universities. So yeah, I mean, you can see it there, this emphasis on education. So when you see today the left portraying Christians as just bigoted, ignorant, and they are anti-science, that's all nonsense.
mm.
Science itself is very connected to the Christian idea that they are God is a rational
Yes,
being that created the world with some meaning, purpose, and some pattern. It's not chaotic, it's not accidental. God cannot, and it's just, it's conterminous. God and the order of the world are kind of inseparable from each other.
and Christianity also teaches us that the natural world does not possess an inherent essence allowing it to act on its own accord. We must use reason to examine natural laws.
Yes, Aquinas, that was a point he emphasized a lot, that uh, God gave us this capacity to reason. He could see it. I'm reasoning. And so, what for? And it's to understand the way in which the world has been created by God. It's just um, a vehicle for us to make sense of the world. And so, they didn't deny the importance of rationality. Obviously, there were things that were beyond rationality that faith is necessary for a Christian, such as how could Jesus Christ be the Son of God? If you think of it in purely rational terms, it's kind of difficult to understand that. But in that case, then you have faith, and that's why Aquinas emphasized faith.
Yes, and there's a difference between Christianity and Islam. Islam produced brilliant intellectuals, but Christianity has a presumption of reason. So, for example, Saint Augustine said, when pagans are being flippant, ignore them. However, if their arguments appear to be serious, use reason to disprove such arguments, whereas in Islam, reason is respected by dissident intellectuals and those who are descendants of Persians. Islamic culture is not particularly compatible with reason and knowledge independent of a supreme being. So, for example, the concept of natural causality for years was never taken seriously in Islam.
Yes,
Whereas
I mean,
you may go ahead.
yeah, Islam, the conception of God that they have is strictly of a transcendental being, a being that is outside this world and can do as it pleases with regards to this world. In the case of Christianity, God is immanent in the world, and for for Muslims, there is an incredible gap between God and human beings, and you can see in the way that um, they kneel to the ground and put their faces to the ground in a total state of submission, whereas Christians do kneel, but they also look up to God, almost as if we can be or have some kind of contact with God, because there is not an unbridgeable gap between us and them. I mean, this is a debate, and it's a complicated debate because some Christians do emphasize, Protestants, people like Martin Luther, emphasize the incredible gap that existed between humans and God. But there is a strong current within Christianity which emphasizes the immanence of God, and they point to Jesus Christ as a kind of bridge, so that God uh, is is relevant in the world and is partakes and participates in the world of human beings, and human beings can do likewise, and they do it through the church, and through that vehicle they try and rise up and connect to the heavens. So in that sense, there is a stronger link between God and human beings. And we were saying before about reason, that's a factor there, that the capacity that human beings have for reason allows them to think about some of the mysteries of the world and to make the world comprehensible to them. That doesn't mean that everything is comprehensible. They will never be able to understand fully why is there a God and a universe in the first place. But it is strong enough that you see among many Westerners rational explanations about why God exists. And you can say they're limited and you can find flaws in them, but that's not the point. The point is that you see these efforts of the mind of Europeans to try and comprehend rationally the existence of God. So, in my view, there has always been with Christianity a strong link with the world of humans and how humans can make sense of their own world by rising up at the same time that God comes down on earth by way of making himself in the flesh through Jesus Christ.
Yes, yes. Quite dazzling point. So, Islam, like other religions, has value, but the truth is that the Islamic golden ages were influenced by Hindu, Greek, Persian, and Christian learning. The Christians were the early translators, and many of them were inspired by the Nestorian Academy. So, in the contemporary world, science is not thriving in Islam. So if Islam and science are really compatible, then a modern society, when people are more educated, then we should see science starting to flourish. But the reverse is true. However, we can now discuss contemporary events. Earlier in the interview, we were talking about the Western civilization and its wealth. And it's popular to teach students and young people and even adults that the West became wealthy due to colonialism. And that is not true. Paul Baroque, the economist, said that there's a strong relationship between slower rates of economic growth and colonial positions. But I would love to hear your argument on the colonialism and development thesis.
Yes, there are many problems. When I was a student and undergrad, this is the view I was taught and I accepted. I believe that the West had extracted masses of resources from the Americas, their silver and gold, and then they put many people to work in plantations, and they brought uh, up to what was it, 10 million slaves, if I remember.
Or over 11 million. The number will vary depending on the writer.
Right. So they brought that many slaves into the New World. And so the argument was that this is what allowed the West to industrialize. And I accepted this view. And as I was saying before, most people to this day accept that view, but it's such a flawed view in so many ways. First, when you look at the amount of wealth that was extracted from the New World, in absolute numbers, it looks big. But when you consider the rest of the economy in the economies of Europe, whether it is the economy of France, of England, and later on other nations, you realize that most of their development is happening within those nations. Most of their populations are within their own nations working. And um, to say that outside forces were really responsible for this industrial revolution has to take into consideration that in relative terms, the contribution, the economic contribution of the colonial trade was not as big as they imply. Even when you look at trade, most of the trade that Europe had was within Europe, among themselves. It was not the colonial trade. Now, this is not to say that the colonial trade, the importing of sugar, tobacco, and many other products, that they didn't play a role. Of course, they play a role. But even when we say that they play a role, well, you have to take into consideration the shipping industry in Europe. They developed the chips. They were the ones who went to the Americas. And then you have to look at many other internal things within Britain, like the legal system, protection of property rights, who is actually doing the investing, where the um, plantation owners, the ones who fuel the new technologies that drove the industrial revolution. No, that there is no connection. Then you look at the fact that Spain extracted most of the silver and the gold, but Spain didn't industrialize. They squandered their wealth. Well, I shouldn't say squander actually, because they did build many beautiful churches. When I was in Spain, I did go to those churches, and you can see the so-called golden age of Spain, at least, produced these churches that you can visit now. But you know the point, what I mean, and that is that they didn't take that money to finance new technologies and the industrial revolution.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of it, so you have Spain with all this colonial wealth, it doesn't industrialize. Then on the other side, you have countries like Switzerland, the Norwegian or the Scandinavian countries, Germany. Germany had what, one colony, two? They barely took anything from those places and became the major industrial power by the 1850s, 60s in Europe. So again, that was not driven by the colonial
Yeah.
trade. And as you were pointing out, there are studies out there. I don't remember now, I read this many years ago, but there are studies out there that show that the cost of having an empire, because of the military occupation, the amount of administrators you have to pay, continuously trying to keep the population subdued, are higher than the amount of wealth you take from it, and so on. So I don't accept that argument, and yet the argument is very popular.
Yeah. Philip Coelho years ago, his study was done in the 70s. He notes that slavery was expensive for British taxpayers. Slavery functioned as a rent-seeking system. And the study was done, a 21st century study, arguing that over several centuries, innovation and population growth explain development in England, not slavery. Innovation is what's responsible for for human flourishing and the great enrichment. Empires are expensive. Sweden operated empires in Europe, and she scrapped her empires. Empires proved to be a burden. So
Yes,
it's a silly argument, but it will just never die. Another dubious thesis was promulgated by that film Black Panther. It is a
yes,
very very silly movie. The great African empires were trading powers like Mali and Axum, and secondly, isolated countries are poor and backward. An isolated African state wouldn't exist today, and if it actually functions similarly to a normal country, it would be very, very poor. Trade is positive, and countries that restrict themselves from the outside world are poor. So Black Panther is popular, but it's a myth. It's a fable.
yes. It's a way of, I guess, achieving cultural equality and even superiority. You blame the West for what they did, and you try and hold a moral argument against them. And this is what has become in many universities. You know, this guy who wrote a paper about 3 years ago
Yes,
in which,
Bruce Gilly. Bruce Gilly.
right, I mean, there was an incredible backlash. I
Yeah.
thought that, this argument had been sufficiently discredited. The idea that Britain industrialized because of African exploitation. But no, I mean, he brought more ammunition, more arguments, a lot of data showing that, in fact, that if anything, it was not so much that Britain benefited, it was the African nations that were
Yes.
colonized that benefited. And so there was a backlash, and I think the journal retracted the article. Um, so you can see, I I don't see us getting away from this situation right now. I think it's going to get worse because of the whole diversity program. The moment Mexicans coming into the United States, they don't come in to assimilate, they come in and join their own ethnic communities. They continue to speak the Spanish language. They don't really have to or care to learn English anymore in the way they did in the past. And there is no incentive because they're being told that your culture actually is better. The reason you're here is because the Americans destroyed Mexico and exploited you, and that's why you're here now. And you should claim the United States as yours. So I don't see us getting away from this situation anytime soon.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Stu-
matter how many arguments you bring. I mean, like Toby Hoff, we mentioned him before, and I like him, but sometimes I get the impression that he thinks if only Muslims read my arguments and Chinese, they'll realize what the West achieved. And I told him, I don't think so. I think they're incentivized to
yes.
look down upon the West.
Students in the States today are being taught to respect the Aztecs and dislike the Western intellectual tradition. I'm not against immigration. Immigration can provide economic benefits, is correlated with innovation and economic growth, but immigrants must assimilate. And if elites discourage immigrants from assimilating, then we're going to have a serious problem because to survive, a country needs a program of life. That's common knowledge. So I see Western civilization imploding because a society without a soul will die, and presently we don't have a soul.
Yes, I mean, it could be that this is an inevitable pattern that all civilizations phase, which is their decline. However, my view, I don't accept the idea of permanent decline. I think that has been wrongly articulated. When you look at Rome by itself in isolation, yes, you can say the rise and fall of Roman civilization. But if you think of Rome as part of the West, then that was a cyclical decline. The medieval era came after, and then you see a rise again. So then you have the waning, the so-called waning of the Middle Ages in the 1300s. You see the economy collapsing in Europe, and then the Renaissance starts. So I don't see decline as something that has to be viewed as permanent. Otherwise, you would not be able to explain the incredible rise of China recently. China has gone through many declines. That's why they have the theory of dynastic cycles.
Yes.
But now it has come back and it is about to become the foremost power in the world. So I don't see that we have to think of the West as declining and then that's it. Somebody else rises. We can see it as a momentary phenomenon that may last, yes, some time, but the West can come back again. But certainly, it is not going to come back with the same ideology.
And this is attributed to cowardice. Too many people on the right are afraid to debate, and I've said it before. Going on Twitter and mocking social justice warriors is not a debate. That's that's just pandering. We're afraid to defend Western civilization or even admit that the Western world is predominantly white. It's a white civilization. Though
Yes, I,
though this does not suggest that we should reject assimilation or foreign cultures, but it's predominantly white.
oh yes, I mean, the academic world right now is not debating anymore at all the most fundamental questions of our time. They're afraid of debate. And so that's another thing that you would think that this is a place where you have open exchange of ideas, but it's the opposite. It's the place where you have the least exchange of ideas. I realized this even when I was in the lab. This is one of the reasons that pushed me out of the lab is that I didn't find the conversations many academics were having to be interesting. When I went to the conferences to present papers, most of the panels were about really gender issues, feminism. I mean, feminism is so powerful. Like, not a single male will dare to question a feminist in university. They never, they do whatever they want. They keep acting like victims. And the men, they all sit really afraid and quietly whenever you go to a faculty meeting, and the women always have something up their sleeves that needs to be changed, and we need more courses on gender, and we women are being discriminated, and we need to hire more of them. No one ever dares to say a word about it. I don't, you know, I don't have too much optimism about what's happening in our university as far as having debates like the conversation we are having now. That these conversations don't happen even among good specialists that know certain aspects of the West, that have done deep research into the Renaissance or the Protestant Reformation. They are very afraid themselves. They stay in their corner. They don't say a word. So the overall intellectual landscape of our university, you just go to the homepage of universities and you read as to who's coming, what's going on in university. Is right now, it's just Black Lives Matter, obsession with diversity, feminism, transsexuals. Every university declares that that's the most important mission right now. So no, there's no debates there really.
Yeah. Shut down STEM. We need more blacks in STEM. We need more blacks in economics. But the paucity of blacks in many areas is due to the achievement gap, as you know. Black
Yeah.
males are less likely to graduate in the US when compared to other groups. They're least likely to graduate. Therefore, if black males are not doing as well as their peers, a black man who's 25 or 30 will not earn as much as a white man. And interestingly, a study was done years ago in the 90s saying that when you account for education and experience, the earnings gap will recede as expected. And even black writers, Roland Fryer, for example, had attributed this gap to skills. But as we both know, we live in a feminine culture. Men take risk. Men are more individualistic. They're less likely to conform. They're competitive. These values drive society. We're now being led by female values.
Yeah,
So we conform. We're nice people and we're empathetic, but we don't reason as well as we ought to.
Right. Universities are a matriarchy right now, and
Yes.
they don't want many women, the feminist women, they envy the men because the men do take more risks and tend to be the more original scholars. And so they're putting them down for that reason and trying to argue that they're too aggressive, they talk too much, they're too competitive, and that universities should not encourage this competitive spirit. So, as you know, there's talk now about getting rid of the grading system.
Yes.
uh, yes, they're going to get rid of it, and they're going to emphasize other ways of marking everybody more or less the same. Um, a lot of the talk, there's so many women now. You have no idea. There's so many women there. Like it's not just academics, the administration is full of them. You look into an office, they're just sitting there all day, and they are. It's all about empathy and munching food and walking on the halls and not doing much, very slow. There is no the spirit of energy of investigation. You just don't see it anymore. It's almost like you're in a social work kindergarten environment. That's how you feel when you're there.
It's just pandering and genuflecting to nefarious desires. So we can apply this thesis to black people in the States. Black people are individuals. They have rights and they also have the ability to work and invest like the rest of us. But I've seen where so many institutions are lowering standards to appease black students. And if you
Yes.
change the grading scheme to appease black students, within the next 10 to 20 years, you will relegate those students to a state of permanent infancy. They will never be able to compete in a global market space.
Yes, I mean that right now is the case. And another thing too, as you may have noticed, is that they are making blacks feel that there are certain subjects that they should study, like black history and black studies and things like that. Almost as if, well, you shouldn't really care about the things that you're interested in because that's not for blacks. You are abandoning your own roots, and this is the same for Hispanics. Hispanics more and more feel that why should I care about these other subjects? They don't speak to me anymore. They're not about my racial identity. And universities, racial identity is every day. That's what people are talking about.
Yes, and there's this incessant claim that the curriculum is too wide. But if you're a serious scholar, you're interested in the idea, not the person. And I've always objected to creating a system that's built on identity politics. So, for example, Panilla, that Princeton academic, he wrote an interesting book on religion, but he's also interested in saving the classics from whiteness. Black people don't need to talk about race all the time, and you can talk about race in the classical world without uprooting the foundations of Western civilization.
Yes, this guy, Panela, I mean, it's just amazing that this argument is taken seriously. I saw a video in which he is presenting his argument to a group of people that are in the classics. And I just couldn't believe that they all sat there and they actually agree with him. And there was a female, I cannot remember her name, but she raised some questions challenging him. And I think she was pushed out, or there were efforts to push her out of the classic organization. And I mean, what he's saying is essentially that we cannot take seriously anymore the study of Plato, Socrates, of Aristotle, and the pre-Socratics and Hippocrates and so on, because they represent whiteness. So then what do you have left to study? Well, in his view, it should be about how they were mean to their slaves, how they benefited from them, and how they promoted supremacy. So that's what he wants to get out of the classic study. I find that absolutely insane because you can do the same for any culture. But he targets the classics and only the classics for this reason. I think in his case, it's a lot of personal animosity. He came from a poor background and maybe suffered certain psychological scars as he was growing up. And now he's taking it against the very society that actually, um, for whatever things he may have done to him when he was young. I don't know exactly what, but he was able to get a very good education and to be accepted into Princeton and get his ideas out. So it just doesn't make sense to me anymore because there is an element of being ungrateful, almost
The
the
ingrate philosophy, Ricardo, the ingrate philosophy. Blacks who have done very well in America usually dislike American society and white people. The ingrate philosophy.
yes, there's something like that that the more they achieve, the more they resent the very society that allowed them to achieve these things.
Yeah, it's really weird and distressing. But as we both acknowledge this pattern will continue. So churches, politicians want Black Americans to get reparations. And as I didn't say this earlier, but without the slave trade, Africa would be richer, but not as rich as Europe, according to none. And Africa still would not have been as wealthy as Latin America. So Black Americans are better off because their ancestors were enslaved. Slavery is bad in all circumstances. So slavery is unfortunate, but a positive consequence of it is the greater living standard of Black people in the West. So, for example, Black people in America and Black people in the Caribbean.
Yes, if you were to say that in a classroom, they would throw you right out of the classroom.
Yeah,
You
so
can-
but I've made similar arguments in pieces, but I write for mostly dissident publication, not the mainstream. So, for example, I am a Jamaican, and there's an argument that colonialism retarded Jamaica's development. But let's be practical. The Taínos did not have a civilization on par with the Romans, the Greeks, the Aztecs, or the Egyptians. It was a society. There was a level of stratification, but it was not a very complex society. So if we're being logical, Jamaica is better off because we're colonized. We
yes,
inherited fairly good institutions from the British, but we failed to appropriate British culture. Singapore had Lee Kuan Yew was serious about development in the 70s. Our prime minister was distracted and he made bad policies. The economy contracted by 25%. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to learn from Israel and Japan, the wealthy countries. He pandered to socialists. So idealism is a serious problem in developing countries. And when where people suffer, they blame the US and England, when on average British colonies are better off. But as we both concur, we can't reason with the left anymore.
no, the same thing, in Puerto Rico, where I was born, when you get into universities and talk with people of that age, they also believe that they have been underdeveloped by the United States and they still suffer and are not able to achieve their full potential. But when I investigated this and I wrote a short article about it, um, the fact is that Americans did a lot good for Puerto Ricans. They gave them many good institutions. They brought a lot of capital and investment. They gave them citizenship. I mean, what more can you ask for? They got citizenship and they got many other things. So nevertheless, they're not grateful for this, but they, on the opposite, they blame them for all their flaws. And I think it's an excuse that politicians use. As you know, this is true across the Americas, that politicians continuously blame the outsider colonialism to this day. And that's what I mean about how influential this idea has been, this notion of colonialism being the means by which Europeans moved ahead and kept the others behind. They use these politicians to blame others for their failures, the incredible corruption that you have in many African nations. In Mexico, it's a totally corrupt society. Um, so it is very useful for them and it's not accurate. And as long as you keep doing that, you're not ever going to mature and become a grown up and start looking at what you can do to improve your society.
You have to be to be rational, Ricardo. So, for example, Jamaica is the home place of reggae, and people complain Jamaicans created reggae, but other countries have a better product. Well, obviously, they have a better product because they possess business and intellectual capital. You cannot sit in in a chair and expect manna to fall into your lap. You have to work.
Yes.
You have to work. So, as we both established earlier, inventions are irrelevant. You must commercialize the product. If you are not interested in doing so, then you're a waste of time, and no amount of pandering can change this. So in the States, there's a new story. Asian anti-Asian racism. Black people are beating Asians. It's so bad that one community started a patrol group. Yet we're being told by liberals that blacks are angry at Asians because of white supremacy.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe subconsciously liberals are racist, and they want black people to suffer.
Yeah, it's
Maybe.
hard to understand because the line now, the deception is so out of this world now, the deception. And but they control the media, so you know it is not true, and I know it is not true. But the young generation, many of the undergraduates, they're the way they get news is controlled through the social media. If they don't look actively for alternative media, they're not going to get the actual truth. So they do believe this garbage that whites are around the US beating Asians for no reason because of, the argument is that they blame them for the virus. But there is absolutely no evidence for that. And this guy clearly, those Asian massages places, parlors, they're called massage parlors.
Mm.
They he said it himself. It was not for racial reasons. And the other thing
He's a
we have
sick.
to,
He's a sick man. He's sick.
yes, and the other thing is that in reality, Asians happen to have ownership of most of these massage parlors in the United States. I saw a statistics that says that over 70%, something close to 75% of those parlors are owned by Asians. And if you take into account that some Asians don't use their Asian names, it could be more than 75%. So it could have been just a coincidence that he happened to have shot Asians because there are more of them around. And I think two people that were not Asian were also shot by
Exactly
him.
my point. But we have an unserious media. Journalists thrive on entertainment and cheap stories. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, they thrive on entertainment and cheap stories, and Biden will always pander to the left. But Ricardo, I believe that our discussion was very insightful, and I just admire your deep level of erudition. And I hope that people will appreciate the nuance of our conversation.
Yes, it was a good conversation, and we should try and have one later on. Doesn't have to be soon, but at some point it would be interesting to keep having a conversation about the state of Western civilization.
And what I like about our conversation is that it is not controlled. So, for example, the intellectual dark web is very popular. Some of its adherents are interesting people, but I do believe that they tend to pander. So I don't have much confidence in these new dissident intellectuals saving our civilization.
Which one are these?
The intellectual dark web, Jordan
Oh
Peterson,
yes, yes,
yeah,
right. Yeah, no, that's not good.
yeah, yeah. They wouldn't have a conversation
Yes,
of
I
this
I
nature.
wish I could have a debate with Jordan Peterson. It would be interesting.
Yeah, but thanks for having you, Ricardo. It was really a pleasure.
All right, thanks. I'll end it here.